I wish everyone a good afternoon or a good morning or evening, depending on where you are. I would like to take this opportunity to not simply recapitulate the Sweden chapter of the report. It's quite rich in detail, I think it's fair to say. So I refer you to the report if you want to look into the details of the Swedish situation. But I would like to highlight some more general points that I think are key. And also, if I have time, to go beyond that and provide a brief idea of some of the very recent trends we're seeing in the right-wing extremist milieu of Sweden and their security implications, and to briefly discuss the evolving Swedish public response to the security threat from this milieu, and finally to offer some concluding reflections. And I will start with what is presented in the report, which is indeed, as speakers have said, a timely resource, which I commend the German Federal Foreign Office for commissioning, and I thank CEP for inviting me aboard to help produce. What, in my view, makes the report valuable is its specific focus on the transnational character of the right-wing extremist movement, which is the main focus of the report. And this really is a key aspect of how the movement functions. And I think this is especially true in the case of Sweden. And as I write in the report, Sweden's extreme right-wing scene exhibits a high degree of transnationality. As a phenomenon, it cannot be understood either historically or today without reference to the international ideological movement of which it forms an interactive element. Efforts to counteract the scene that fail to analyze it in transnational terms are unlikely to be effective. Recently, the Swedish State Security Service, the country's main CVE and CT agency, observed that the threat, that is the intention and the ability of violence promoting right-wing extremism in Sweden, is affected to a high degree by actors and conditions outside of the country's borders. This is a crucial point, but it certainly also goes both ways. Sweden is not only influenced by developments abroad, but is itself an important node for influencing right-wing extremists all over the world. As we detail in the report, whether it's the Nazi Nordic resistance movement, NRM, actively and operationally orchestrating campaigns of racially motivated hate crimes across the Scandinavian region, or whether it's so-called alt-right media outlets radicalizing their readers by churning out tales about the supposed apocalyptic collapse of Swedish society under so-called mass migration or runaway political correctness, or whether it's the organizers of the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in the United States, citing the NRM with its violent militancy and organizational discipline as a source of inspiration for their own activity, or the 2019 Christchurch terrorist Brenton Tarrant praising in his manifesto, among others, the Swedish perpetrator of a 2015 white supremacy motivated school attack in a small Swedish town, or indeed the same Tarrant writing the name Ebba Åkerlund on one of his rifles, the name of a Swedish child who was turned into an icon of martyrdom by right-wing extremists after she was killed in a radical Islamist terror attack. The list of such citations and references goes on and on. Sweden has an outsized presence in the ideological imaginary and inspirational canon of the Western right-wing extremist movement. But this is no accident. Swedish right-wing extremists have been working hard, not just in the half-decade period that's covered by our report, but for— Morgan,
I don't want to interrupt you, but we don't see the next slide of your presentation. I'm not sure if that's the introduction to the presentation and the other slides come later, but we just saw the opening slides. The opening slide, not anymore.
Now?
Now I can see, yes, I can see the second slide, yes.
Great.
Fantastic.
So, yes, I'm still on my first slide. So for literally a century, right-wing extremists in Sweden have been working hard to connect itself physically, ideologically, and strategically to its counterparts around the world, not just in the recent few years. Sweden, as a country that did not take part in the Second World War, has never outright banned fascist groups or right-wing extremist associations ever in its history, not even after World War II. And while the degree of activity on the part of such actors has waxed and waned over the decades, they have developed and evolved as a continuously present movement, passing the torch to each new generation, reinventing its discourse and adapting its operational modes to suit the times, but always maintaining a remarkably coherent ideological program of violent racism and, which is the point here, always looking outward to its ideological counterparts in the rest of the world in a continuous process of mutual learning and inspiration, and in bids to gain prestige vis-a-vis domestic rivals. To go back to the very origins, in the 1920s and 1930s, Swedish extreme right-wing extremists, Swedish right-wing extremism was influenced by German Nazism and Italian fascism. Already by then, Swedish Nazis made numerous trips to Germany and curried favor with the German NSDAP party. In the post-war period, key actors in Sweden's extreme right wing played important roles in helping to rebuild the international fascist scene through initiatives such as the European Social Movement, or Europäische Soziale Bewegung. In the 1960s, Swedish Nazis networked with the American Nazi leader George Lincoln Rockwell's movement, and in the third wave, in the 1990s, the new generation of Swedish extreme right-wing militants, many of whom play key functions in the scene today, were influenced to a very high degree by the British white power music scene and the American white supremacist scenes. And in this stage of their development, the movement became more overtly homicidal and terroristic in its theory as well as in its practice. And the ambassador alluded to this in her opening remarks. The 1990s were a very violent, bloody period for Sweden in this regard. And this is the period, of course, in which the Nordic resistance movement was originally founded in 1997, and in its formative years was inspired by the American extreme right-wing terror group, the Silent Brotherhood, also known as the Order, just to take a key example. Now, there's no room here, unfortunately, in my view, to give a lecture on the history of the Swedish extreme right wing, but it is very important to contextualize the movement and contextualize what we say in the report. And in particular, to understand that transnationality has been an essential property of the Swedish movement from the very beginning. In this sense, the high degree of transnationality observed in the report represents not a novelty, but a culmination of a long-running trend. What is qualitatively new, however, is not only the immediacy that modern technology and social media provide, the immediacy of this transnational connectivity, that is, but that contemporary right-wing extremism has begun to be geared and designed to interface with the international movement. Whereas in the past, in the classical period, in the earlier waves, this was perhaps a more secondary concern, although it was always a function, it was always there. At this point is not just academic. It matters for understanding that the phenomenon of transnationality is no temporary issue that might go away tomorrow or in a putative next stage of development of this movement. It is built into the extremist phenomenon that we are looking at in this report in both ideology and operationality, that is, in both theory and practice. In today's Swedish extreme right-wing milieu, we can conceptualize this global outreach as being conducted by two parts of the movement. So I'm just going to move to the next slide. A recent study of the milieu carried out by the Swedish Defense University analyzed the movement as having two parts: the violent extremists themselves and the alternative right, or alt-right, which is adjacent to the violent militants and which is less formally organized and often less directly violent, but which constitutes a sprawling array of propaganda outlets that push the same apocalyptic ideological narratives common to the Western extreme right and that directly or indirectly urge violent action. These propaganda outlets and actors help signal boost the violent extremists. They help disseminate their ideas into wider society. They contribute to the dehumanization of the extremist targets, and help radicalize potential recruits into sympathizing with or approaching the milieu. Of course, the violent extremists, in particular the NRM, also produce their own propaganda. And in recent years, in the period covered by the report, the NRM has become particularly active in this and has ramped up its production of propaganda of the deed, documenting their own actions and then publishing them systematically. But it is, I think, to even a greater extent, this adjacent alt-right media operation, or more properly, propaganda operation. It is through this that Sweden and its extreme right-wing militants gain such relative prominence on the global stage. Without it, few people, even the most ardent sympathizer, would have much of an idea what goes on in this small country of 10 million people. But because of it, Sweden is often successfully posited as an ideological frontline or a key battleground in the movement's global struggle for white supremacy. I'll finish this point by arguing that researchers, scholars, and security officials looking at the transnational extreme right wing should pay particularly close attention to Sweden in this regard, as an agenda-setting producer of far-right narratives and ideological talking points, which are constantly supplied to and rapidly consumed by counterparts elsewhere. This ideological connectivity is, I think, even more decisive than the many physical and operational contacts that Swedish extremists also maintain and which are more thoroughly detailed in the report, such as the many trips to Germany and to the Baltic region, the long-standing ties between Swedish and Polish right-wing extremists, and so on. Now I will quickly say a few words about the most recent developments in Sweden. This slide is a graph. I won't go into complete detail about this, but this graph represents the rate of activity carried out, public activity or activism carried out by the Swedish right-wing extremist groups. The green line represents the share of the NRM's activities. And the yellow line represents the totality of the movement's activities over time, and the black line represents groups that are not the NRM. And what this graph obviously shows, I think intuitively, is that around 2015, the NRM became a highly, almost hegemonic actor on the stage of Swedish right-wing extremism and tended to overshadow the other groups. Now, I've also already discussed the NRM and its recent history in great detail in a previous CEP seminar available on their website, so I won't talk too much about the NRM here. What I will say is that, as this graph indicates, although its data only reaches as far as 2019, we're about to produce our next annual report and we'll update this data during the spring. But the NRM is currently in a period of decline. They haven't quite recovered from two important setbacks. They participated in the general elections in 2018 and had a very poor result. And they had a subsequent split of their organization in 2019. And they're still sort of licking their wounds after that. They're bleeding activists. They're not at the same level of operational capacity. So they continue to decline in importance. Although they remain a security challenge and a security threat. And as I noted in the CP webinar on the NRM, the same factors that were in play when rogue members of the NRM, apparently rogue members, carried out a series of terror attacks in the Gothenburg region in the winter of 2016, 2017, the same factors are pretty much still in play. And I will briefly go to this next slide and just revisit something I talked about in the previous seminar as well, which is, I think, a very illustrative example of how the NRM continues to be a security threat to the entire Nordic region. What this slide is a quote that is an excerpt that was reviewed by the prosecutor in a recent trial of a regional leader of the NRM's branch in Denmark. And the prosecutor read this text message out, which had been taken from the regional NRM activist's cell phone, which showed that the Danish NRM activists committing acts of vandalism and hate crimes on the Memorial Day of the November pogrom in 2019 was part of a coordinated campaign, a simultaneously carried out campaign across the Scandinavian countries of vandalism and hate crimes. And the message that had been found on this NRM activist's phone read, that he had sent out to his underlings in the NRM, read, "Important information. There has been a directive from Simon Lindberg," that's the top national leader of the Nordic resistance movement. "All Nordic countries come together for a pan-Nordic operation on Kristallnacht between 8 and 9 November. We are to anonymously attack Jewish targets. We are after Jews or businesses owned by so-called real Jews. Your assignment next month is to find out whether there are any Jewish targets in your areas. This is top secret information." Now, this, I think, shows very clearly how the NRM operates transnationally, how the Swedish sort of main branch of the NRM exports violent extremist crimes to its neighboring countries in a very sort of sophisticated, relatively sophisticated and seamless way. And this was, these crimes, this campaign of vandalization and hate crimes was carried out after the split and during this period of decline that I'm discussing. So the NRM remains a security challenge. So it is clear that the NRM is declining in importance in the scene, relatively speaking. And for the second year in a row, because of the pandemic, the organization will not be holding its traditional rally on the 1st of May, which deprives them of important publicity and prestige. The organization is currently geared very much towards achieving publicity and thereby attracting new potential recruits and so on, and maintaining their standing both domestically and internationally in the scene. So as far as organizations go, the NRM remains the preeminent and by far the most dangerous extreme right-wing organization in Sweden, but the Swedish milieu is becoming more post-organizational, fragmented and heterogeneous, with more extremists turning to either setting up their own alternative right-style media operations or clustering in small, independent, quote-unquote, fight clubs, where they focus on building up their capacity for violence and close-quarters combat. It's important to say that this overall trend follows a long-standing pattern in the Swedish milieu, where one organization will grow for several years and expand, overshadowing the rest of the scene, spurring their competitors to come up with alternative forms of activism, only to decline and motivating many former members to leave and join smaller groups and looser networks. Activists who will often be longing for an even more radical option to appear on the scene. So it is important not to confuse the declining strength of the NRM as a sign that the milieu itself is weakening or becoming less violent. Indeed, there are signs that one of the most virulent new strains of extreme right-wing ideology, the tendency of terrorist accelerationism, is finding purchase among Swedes. 2 men were recently convicted of having carried out an act of arson motivated by eco-fascist ideology. They proved to be part of the so-called Green Brigade network that existed primarily on Telegram, and at least one of the men who were convicted also appears to have been a member of the Base, an American extremist network that was recently designated a terrorist group by the Canadian government. Another trend that we're seeing, which I think is particularly salient in light of the apparent decision by the German Domestic Intelligence Service to place the Alternative for Germany party under surveillance, although there has not been, from what I understand, an official statement on it, but that appears to be the case. And in light of this, it's interesting and important to note that the main party of the Swedish far right, the Sweden Democrats, have in recent times adopted a sort of new ideological posture, new strategic posture, where they appear to be extending a sort of olive branch to the more extreme, what we can call alternative right media networks to their right, which is a new tendency as opposed to their posture in the previous years. And I think that there has been a conventional wisdom that the Sweden Democrats, as they grew and took their place in parliament and became closer to the political establishment, would grow less radical, and that is not necessarily what we're seeing at all. So I think that this is also a key development in the Swedish extremist scene that is worth paying attention to. So yes, quickly, I see that I've run a bit over time. I will just very, very quickly say that we are awaiting a few key moments to see in which direction the Swedish public response to the security threat is going. The all-party parliamentary committee considering a prohibition on racist organizations that the ambassador mentioned initially was supposed to deliver its final report by the end of February, but its mission was extended, perhaps in order to evaluate the effects in Finland or for other reasons. They have not yet reached any decision, but relatively reliable media reports suggest that perhaps in something of a potential paradigm shift, there appears to be a potential majority of parties in parliament willing to consider some form of perhaps not a direct prohibition of racist organizations, but a ban on collaborating with a racist organization, for example. And this would certainly have an effect on the Nordic resistance movement, or it would pertain to the Nordic resistance movement, which in its channels have commented these reports in the media by sort of darkly and menacingly saying that, well, if we get banned, then people might start committing terror acts like Brenton Tarrant or Anders Behring Breivik did. So that has been their response to these news reports. In spring, we're also expecting the annual report of the Swedish Security Service. I don't have time now to discuss how they have evolved in their analysis of this security threat from this milieu, but I think they're moving in a direction of emphasizing more the role of ideology, how the diffusion of extreme right-wing ideology into the public increases the rate of radicalization and introduction into this milieu. We're also waiting, as the ambassador also mentioned, the annual terrorist threat assessment. And it will be interesting to see whether they maintain the trajectory that they've had for just a couple of past 2 or 3 years, or 2 years really, of sort of upgrading this threat and taking it more seriously than they did for a very long time historically. And of course, we're waiting new counter-terrorist legislation, which had it been in place several years ago, we might well have seen prosecutions for terrorist crimes against the NRM, but that was not the case at the time. I think Mr. Heinze spoke so well initially about what governments ought to do, so I won't get into that, but I just will finish by saying that specifically for Sweden, I think the government of Sweden should really reconsider the decision in 2005 that the Swedish Security Service stopped publishing public data on the rate of extremist crimes and on the incidence of anti-constitutional offenses or anti-constitutional activity. There is no public data on violent extremism, as far as I'm aware, being published by Swedish agencies. And the agencies themselves don't really have an answer to why that is. They refer back to the politicians and say that, well, that has to be a political decision. And I think the Swedish government and Swedish political leaders perhaps should take a page out of Germany's book and really show leadership on this issue and sort of send the normative signal to agencies, to researchers, to law enforcement, to prosecutors, that this is a problem that we need every tool that we can possibly get in the effort to contain this security threat. Yes, I've gone over time, so I will end there. Thank you very much.